Now that we're reasonably familiar with the Xcode interface and we've learned how to run a blank app on the simulator, we're going to start to add some content to our apps. And we're going to do that by having main storyboard selected. And I'm going to get rid of the console for the moment because we don't need that. And down here, we're going to now look at what's known as the object library. If you can't see that for any reason, make sure you've got main storyboard selected and the circle with a square inside it is blue. And that will show you the object library. And if you scroll down here, you can see all the different types of user interface elements that we can add to our apps. They're starting to get more familiar as you get further down. A quick way to jump to a particular user interface element is to start to search for it in the filter box at the bottom. And we want perhaps the simplest user interface element, label. So once we've typed that in, we can just drag, so just click with the mouse and drag in your label. And there it is. So we've now got a label on our iPhone screen. And I'm just going to zoom in by pinching on my trackpad here. There's my label. So I'm going to just quickly double click on that and type Hello World to change the text of the label to Hello World. And now we're going to run the app again, jump back over to the simulator, and this time instead of seeing a blank app, we should see an app with Hello World towards the top left. And there we go. You can see our first app which actually does something. Now you may have noticed when I dragged that label in that there were some guidelines that appeared. Let's have a look at those in a little bit more detail. I can just drag it around here, and if I drag it to the left, you can see a blue dotted line, and there's another one just there. If I drag it to the center, I get another one, and then to the right there as well. And there's one down here right in the middle. Now these make it very easy to align your labels or whatever it is that you're bringing in to, say, the very center of the phone screen. But remember that that will only work for the particular phone screen size that you've got there at the moment. So don't rely on that to, for example, center your label on every phone size. To do that, we need to use something called constraints, which we'll look at later on in the course. For now, let's just see how we can adjust the look and content of this label. So notice in the context menu on the right here, if you have the label selected, then you'll be able to see a bunch of options for that label. So first off, you have the option to choose between plain and attributed text. Attributed allows you to use a special format to customize things like fonts and sizes. That's rather more complicated than plain, so we're not going to be looking at that right now. So we'll stick with plain. We can edit the content of the text label right there. But notice that if you do that, it doesn't change the width of the text label. So if, for example, you changed the content to something longer, then it would no longer fit. So you might need to stretch out the label if you change the content after you create the label. Color is pretty straightforward, but it allows us to see the color palette that we get with Xcode. We can either choose from a range of pencil colors there. You can see it updates immediately as we click on the colors, or you can choose a number of other ways to get your colors from a color wheel. You can even use the dropper to pick from a color anywhere on your screen. So if I particularly like that blue, for example, I can grab that and keep that as the color of my text. And you can use RGB sliders, pick from some of the default colors, or grab from a spectrum. So if we pick the green there, we can even choose the opacity, which allows us to create a label which is a little bit see-through. There's another way that we can do that, and I'll show you that in a minute. So that's how we choose the color of the label. I'm going to stick with this lovely green. We can also edit the font. So just click on the T there, and you can choose from all the standard fonts that we're used to seeing. Try that one out. There we go. and you can change the style to say bold or italic, and of course change the size as well. So if we increase that a little bit, then notice again, if it goes outside the range of our initial label box, we'll need to resize that to be able to see the whole thing. So I'll just drag it a little bit and then resize it. So we can see it there. And of course, if you've done that, you'll need to recenter as well. There we go. We can choose the number of lines our label has, which could be useful if I want a really long label. Then by default, that will go all on one line. So if I wanted it on 2 lines, I could just increase that to 2. And then we'll see our label on 2 lines there. If you want an infinite number of lines, so as many lines as necessary, then you can put 0 there. That's quite handy. You can choose whether the behavior is enabled or highlighted. You probably won't need to use either of those. And I'm going to jump through these rather advanced formatting options, aligning baselines, etc. But I will show you the quite handy auto shrink feature, which if, for example, your text is too big for your box, then you can choose to have a minimum font scale, which will allow all the text to appear, but that minimum font scale will only let it go so small. So in this case, 0.5. If you want it to go smaller than that, then you can change that to say 0.1, and then it will go even smaller. Whether that's a good idea or not depends on your particular app. Then we've got the option to add a highlight and a shadow. I'll just show you what shadow looks like. So we can add, say, a blue shadow there and change the offset. So that looks fairly ugly, but you get the idea of what's going on there. The offset is the number of pixels to the right and below that the shadow appears compared to the original text. Then we've got a few view options, most of which we're not going to use right now, but we will see later on. Labels generally don't have any interaction to them, so multiple touch is not particularly useful. It's worth noting the alpha. This value is another way of changing the opacity that we saw before. So 1 is an opacity which is completely not see-through. But if we change that to, say, 0.5, then that will be half see-through. And the lower the number, the fainter the text, or the less opaque it is. So that can be very useful. We can change the background. Nice and easy. And finally, we've got some fairly advanced options which aren't really of any use to us here. Feel free to play around with them if you like, but most of the time with labels, we're just going to be customizing fonts, colors, and sizes. So hopefully that's all pretty straightforward. I'm going to set you a quick challenge to give you a practice with labels. So I want you to select your label and then press backspace to delete it. And quite simply, I want you to create a label that looks like this. That is situated at the top of the screen, just underneath the battery info bar. At the center, says hi there, is centered, and is pretty big. I'm not going to be too fussy about the precise size. So pause the video and go for it. All right, hope you managed that. Should have been a fairly straightforward challenge. All you needed to do was drag in the label, and we wanted it centered and just underneath the battery bar there. So I'm going to make sure it's aligned to those 2 blue dotted lines. Remember, that will only work on the iPhone 6s and the iPhone 6 because they're the same size. It won't be centered on all devices. Then I'm going to change the text to hi there, like that, and I'm going to increase the size. There we go. Next, I'm just going to resize that so that I can see the whole thing. And to make sure it's centered, I'm going to click center there and then drag it back in place again so that it's definitely centered now that I've changed the size. All right. And as much as this should be a perfect representation of what you see on your screen, it's always a good idea just to run it on the simulator to make absolutely sure that it appears correctly. And there we go. You can see we've got our text just under the info bar at the top. It says hi there, and it's pretty big. So that's as far as we're going to go with labels. Feel free to add some more and play about with them if you like, but we're going to head towards some rather more interactive user interface elements in the next video, and they are text inputs and buttons.